Hello, and welcome to Imposter Hour with Liz and Greg, where we explore self doubt, imposter characters, and sometimes real life con artists. We are so excited about our guest today.
Halley Sutton is a writer and editor who lives in Los Angeles, where she spends her time chasing down old Hollywood trivia and cults. Her first novel, The Lady Upstairs, was nominated for a Lefty Award. Her second novel, The Hurricane Blonde, was an instant USA Today bestseller. Her writing has appeared in Writer's Digest, Ms., The Daily Beast, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Crime Reads, Crimes Free Magazine, and more. Halley, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for coming on.
Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here in conversation with you both. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. This is a big get for us. We are big fans of your writing. And also, I mean, your debut really kind of dives right into to the whole kind of con imposter thing right off the bat. So we thought you would be a great fit, not only as a fun conversationalist, but also with your material as well.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, when you emailed asking, what kind of angle did I want to cover? And I was thinking of The Lady Upstairs and like, gosh, I wish I had a real life con artist story for you both to share. Although probably that wouldn't be good in real life, but like those are always such fascinating stories to me. Yeah, I know, exactly. So I'm like very happy I don't, but also like, oh, that would be, it's always fun to hear about.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you almost do want to have a bit of separation between church and state when it comes to writing and living.
For sure.
Although, Halley, I feel like with the subject matter, certainly of your second book and writing about Hollywood and old Hollywood, you kind of braid those two together. There are a lot of kind of known imposters that you touch upon, so I think you are very well versed, even if you haven't had direct experience. But I would love you to start with where you feel imposter syndrome in your actual life before we get into your characters.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, great question. Let's start with my bio. I sent my bio over and I always keep in there writer and editor. And I often actually, like if I'm just meeting people out in the world, I'll often just introduce myself as an editor because I do work in publishing, Liz. I know you have a background of working in publishing too. And it's, for a long time, I was sort of like, it's because it's the thing that's easier to understand. I feel like as a woman, I'm in my mid-30s, but often presenting younger or having been younger in my career. When I say I'm a writer, I get a lot of like, oh, that's cute. Or, so you self-publish. And it just, or even if I didn't get that, there was maybe I had an internal perception that was how I was going to be perceived. So often I will just introduce myself as an editor. And I have decided in the last year that is very silly. I have 2 books traditionally published, and not that I think traditional publishing is the only way in which to feel valid as a writer, but like, why am I doing this to myself? Why can't I own that? So I have writer and editor in there. So that's an area I feel a lot of imposter syndrome around, even just claiming the identity of writer, which is so funny because it's like one of the things that I feel has been most central to my personality and my sense of self since I was a little kid. And yet there's something about owning it in public that I struggle with a little bit. So that's one aspect. The second aspect would be my second novel, The Hurricane Blonde, was indeed an instant USA Today bestseller, but sort of on a technicality. And so I always feel a little weird saying that's true. Although at this point it'll be carved on my headstone and they can take that title away from me, like out of my cold dead hands. But like it's a, when you say your book is a bestseller, then you have certain expectations for it about how much people would know it or how much it is actually sold. And my book didn't necessarily hit those benchmarks, but did actually make the list. I don't know. So I have like layers of imposter syndrome there.
Right.
Well, you just mentioned, you said within the last year, you've been trying to refocus. Was there anything in particular that's happened that kind of got you to try and reframe that for yourself? Or has it just been a gradual
That's what I wanted to know.
Yeah.
It's been a gradual journey, but I will say there was like one particular moment I was actually at a writer's retreat in Mexico with a good friend of mine from grad school. And we had this guy, Pickleball Jim, I'll call him. Jim was his actual name, but I don't know his last name. And he would always, like, every morning. So we were at this retreat, and it was hosted at this kind of boutique hotel. So there were other people there. There were a lot of expats down there at this part of Mexico. And so he would come over and talk to us all the time. And he kind of had this patronizing attitude of this sort of like, it's cute that you guys think you're a writer, but let me read to you something I wrote in my journal last night. Like, multiple times he would come up to us and give us impromptu readings. And like, I have a tendency to maybe be a little too people pleasery about it and to sort of be like, oh, okay, this is fine. And my friend was like, this is not fine. And so finally she was like, you know, she's gotten things actually published, and like went off. And I was sort of like, if my friend can do this and I can't, like, I should be the one kind of like putting up these boundaries and like owning my identity. And so there was something about seeing my friend sort of do it on my behalf that maybe was sort of like, don't outsource this to your friends, like own your confidence.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's kind of been my journey with it.
Okay.
So thank you, Pickleball Jim, for the unexpected things, I suppose.
Well, and I am just amen to friends who can publicize us in places that we aren't able to for ourselves, you know, because I certainly, anyone who has finished a book, even if it hasn't been published, if someone has actually successfully written a book from, you know, beginning to end, they are a writer in my opinion. So, and I will tell them that, you know, and
Yes.
the other work I do with coaching and editing, I think that's the first and most important thing, is to identify as a writer if you sit down and do it. And then all of this kind of other stuff that happens, the publishing process, the bestseller lists, you know, the various awards, that's important if you want it to be important. But, you know, I think it can only be as important as you place, you know, the importance on it, because I think other people's validation with that stuff, it gets so murky. And it's just not, it's at least not where we find the pleasure of being authors.
Absolutely. And I think this resonates with a conversation you had previously had on your podcast. But like, if there's so many ways for publishing to make you feel sort of small, and for like those external stakes to be always shifting and always relative to somebody else's success, that like, if you really do put it outside of yourself, it's going to be constantly both invalidating and never feel as good as you want it to. That like, there's the difference between, you know, I think you were talking about this with I'm sorry, I'm forgetting her name. She wrote
with Patricia Park.
Yes. And talking about kind of like, do you want to be an author? Do you want to be a writer? And like, whether those stakes are kind of validated inside you or outside you, I think is such an important sense of self to like develop, because this industry can make you feel very small a lot of the times. Even as wonderful things are happening, there's like, oh, well, somebody else is a bestseller, or they've sold a bunch of copies, or their advance was bigger, or, you know, they're getting these opportunities. I mean, my personal thing that like I aspire to is to be able to sell a book on like a paragraph, that I just shoot an editor. And I know people who can do that, right? Where they just shoot their editor, like, I'm thinking something like this. And they're like, great, we'll take it. And you're like, that's what I want, you know? So there's always something else you want outside of you. It's about the, but what can you cultivate internally to like maintain in those moments?
Right. That's such good advice. Yeah, cultivating internally, and I think making goals for yourself as a writer versus having these milestones that kind of make or break you, you know, like reframing. And you just said being able to encapsulate, you know, a pitch of a book in a paragraph, which is a really great skill to have as a writer, because as we all know, someone says, what do you do? I'm a writer. What do you write? You know, in my experience, if I say thrillers, people kind of like shut off or turn on.
Totally. Yeah.
But if you can kind of elevator pitch a story that people can relate to, then you can really engage.
Yeah.
And of course, you have to hand sell your book, you know, wherever you go.
Yes. That's also true.
So shifting to your first book, we alluded to it, but your character is, I would say, by definition, a con artist. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely.
Do you want to tell us
yes.
a little bit about writing her?
Sure, absolutely. So my first book, The Lady Upstairs, is the story of a woman named Jo who works at a blackmail agency with, that targets bad rich men, hires young women to kind of seduce them, and then use that to blackmail them. Something inevitably goes wrong. People wind up dead. She's got a debt to clear. Very kind of neo-noir, wanting to make the femme fatale a very literal femme fatale, like her business card might actually say femme fatale, but also have her be the protagonist. And kind of, I think when I was thinking about her as a con artist and as an imposter, I was thinking about how much that book is an LA story and how much LA is an imposter city in so many ways. It's, a city that should not really exist here. Like, we steal water from other places to maintain this as a city. It's a desert that's also like beachside. It's just a very strange place. And then that's even before you get into the Hollywood of it all, which is just this artifice. And Hollywood is something I'm endlessly fascinated by, both creatively and in my personal life, is the way that Hollywood is both very real. Like, we are a company town here. Hollywood is like the engine of so much commerce and economics here. And yet it's also an idea. Like, if you actually go to Hollywood, the part of the city, it's very disappointing. That's not what you're looking for. You're looking for the like glitz and glamour that kind of has never really existed except in these small pockets of places and wealth. But it's just become this idea that has become intrinsic to the city. And so when I was thinking about The Lady Upstairs, I was thinking about that, the way that Los Angeles can wear so many different disguises, the way that if you were doing this business that Jo is in, that there's inherently, you're creating a front, right? They're training these women to seduce these men, to toy with these men. It's not something authentic or genuine, except within the course of the book when it starts to become authentic for one of the girls, which is a problem. And that Jo herself has to become kind of a false version of herself in order to do this. And that part of the fun for me in this book was writing somebody who got to wear that sort of false cape of like, I'm not going to feel, but of course she can't help but start to feel herself in various different ways throughout the book. And so something that I wanted to keep in, that I wrote early on in my MFA program and people liked, and I decided I was going to keep it forever. And we can talk about the MFA imposter of it all. Was you actually, there's a scene in the book where you find out that Jo is not her real name, but you never find out what her real name is. And so there's even a sense within the novel of like, this person, this is an artifice that I'm never actually going to get to know, even as some of it is very real.
I love that. We talk a lot on the show about self-deception within ourselves and imposter syndrome, but within characters, and that kind of Russian doll effect of having, the kind of on the face plot of duplicity, but then getting underneath, where characters are deceiving themselves, or, the kind of nod, I think, to the reader when you do something like have a character who reveals that her name isn't actually the name we've been with for the whole book, but you never give us the name.
Right.
Which is quite a trick. Yeah, I love that.
And I love writing. I think it's really, there's something really fun about, for me, especially about writing and reading those characters that have those sort of layers where like you enter a novel knowing that you're reading fiction, and then even within the fiction being like, oh, this is a fiction itself. Like, there's, like you said, that Russian nesting doll quality of it is so fun to unpack as a reader.
Yeah. Yes. I think there's also, speaking of the Russian nesting doll, I'll take that as an excuse to kind of mention the Hurricane Blonde as well. Again, we're talking about, there's the old Hollywood, new Hollywood component. You also have the kind of classic noir, which you sprinkle in a lot of Easter eggs and a lot of kind of tip of the caps to that as well. But you're also doing something amazing with it in your own right as a neo-noir, because you're taking, I think, the kind of the spirit and the model of that. There's the noir model, which is based on the sort of the feeling of alienation and the disillusionment with these institutions, but you're almost, while paying homage to it, you're almost flipping it inside out and inverting it, because you're making it a feminist tale, and you're making almost like the patriarchy and misogyny the institutions themselves that your character is pushing back against. And I feel like that's just such an amazing inversion. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that process.
Sure, absolutely. Greg, that was so wonderful. Like, can you be my hype guy forever? That was amazing.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My relationship to noir was also really fostered to moving to LA and kind of using that as a lens to better understand the city. And there was so much here in the history of LA, both like it's one of the birthplaces of noir, right? There's so many films that were shot here that are classic noir. There's Raymond Chandler, James Cain comes to Hollywood. There's so many like real aspects of noir, but then the city itself has a very noirish history. And I think one of the things that I really discovered, and one of the ways that like noir really speaks to me, is that it is almost always, in my opinion, about forces bigger than the protagonist that are really impacting the protagonist's life that they can't get out from underneath. And so for me as a woman, that was just like, well, sure, I see that. I was writing this in 2015, 2016, Trump's getting elected, and just feeling like there's this mountain that you're kind of up against. And so it was really cathartic to kind of use that as a vehicle to invert it. And even if, the whole classic thing of noir is that you can't really win,
right.
Like that you can have maybe small wins and that you like solve the case or you do whatever, but like you're still up against those things. And so there was something that felt very much like my life of being like, I'm not going to overturn a Trump presidency, or I'm not going to overturn some of these things that I really am struggling with, but I can write this character who's decided that she's going to live outside the bounds of what I would ever do with my life. I'm going to write this character who's going to find her own way to deal with these institutions. That's at least the lady upstairs. And then in the Hurricane Blonde, it's sort of this discovering of how much more the deck is stacked against you and how much more closely those ties come in without giving anything away, as Salma's kind of like grown up in Hollywood. And I had a lot of fun playing with tropes and Easter eggs, like you say. I don't know about you guys, but I feel like sometimes a novel is like one long marathon of keeping yourself entertained. Like one of the things that I have to do to like keep writing is like, I'm going to put in an allusion to Body Heat, or I'm going to put in an allusion to Chinatown, or like these things that are really meaningful to me or have like formed my own sensibilities as an artist, just because it's so long and hard to write a book. And so you have to like play little games with yourself to keep yourself going. And so I wanted to write the Hurricane Blonde and have it be, what if you had this great American film? And in my mind, it was sort of like Chinatown and these people who have been, kind of intrinsic to it and had this Hollywood love story that everyone sees, but there's just this like layers of rottenness at the core of it. And that those things might also speak to some of the bigger issues that I think we all see are problematic in Hollywood, right?
Well, I suppose in some sense, the reason why neo-noir is continues to be a thriving kind of genre is because a lot of that sort of disillusionment and those feelings that you mentioned of authority weighing down on people, unfortunately, have not really gone anywhere. In fact, we're seeing new fresh waves of that. And not that obviously you need any particular reason to be writing feminist novels that are taking on the patriarchy, but we sadly have plenty of reasons to do it all over again. So
right,
absolutely,
yeah.
And Hollywood is such a fertile ground for that. I mean, you've alluded a little bit to the pull of LA and Hollywood in your books, and you're not a local Californian, is that right? You're not. So when did that kind of fascination begin, and then how was it to actually move there and immerse yourself there?
Sure. So I am a local, I am a native Californian, but not of Southern California. I'm like as culturally far from Southern California as you can get. I grew up in a small town called Arcata up in Humboldt County that's in the Redwoods. I mean, it's like what you would think of Oregon is what it looks like. So it's an hour and a half south of the Oregon border. So it's about as far from LA as you can get and still find like a town. Sorry, Crescent City, it's a little bit untrue, but like, so I actually was kind of obsessed with old Hollywood as a kid, and I'm not entirely sure where it came from, but like I did History Day projects on Clara Bow. I used to kind of look up things about Clark Gable and just kind of had this fascination with, I don't know. And I've thought about this before. I think that there's a way in which Hollywood functions as like the cool group in high school, or maybe our royalty or something. It's like people who we have a stake in feeling that we know, but we don't actually know them. So it's fun to gossip about them. It's fun to read their, foibles and be like, are Bennifer getting divorced again? Like we all get like, not, I shouldn't say we all, but like it's a very common thing to get invested in that. And I think I was from a young age, but even about like generations that were like, further back than my parents, like my grandparents. And so I kind of I moved to the Bay Area for a while and worked in publishing there. And then when I decided to go to grad school, that I was going to take 2 years and really pursue writing a novel, and I didn't know what about yet. I knew I had a strong character voice of somebody who would eventually become Joe, but I didn't really have the frame of my novel yet. I was like, I have never wanted to live in Los Angeles. I've always been interested in old Hollywood, but I never wanted to live there. And I was like, well, that would be an interesting way to spend 2 years. I don't know if that's the answer you're looking for, but I basically was like, what if I just went against every impulse I've ever had and tried something new? And I moved here, and within 6 months was like, I love it. I want to stay. And there's just something so fascinating about the city to me. And I find it very like creatively fascinating. It really is like, it's not a city. It's like 92 small cities stapled together. It's just everything you could ever possibly want is here in LA. And I'm obsessed with Hollywood and old Hollywood. I go on, like true crime bus tours that talk about, different starlets who have died in weird ways, or different people, or I'll go on like studio tours and different things. So with my second book, I was really excited that I got to like lean all the way into that and really be like, let your weird old Hollywood freak flag fly.
I mean, that's evident from the first page where you have Black Dahlia,
Right.
which, is so engrossing for people who know. And then I imagine for people who maybe don't know that story to go down that rabbit hole. And I actually, it's funny you mentioned Chinatown, and I felt that throughout the whole book. But also Hollywood Babylon. Do you remember that book, or did you come across
I'm
that
obsessed with Hollywood Babylon. I'm obsessed with Hollywood Babylon. It is so horrible, such a book that says such horrible things about people, and it is so fun to read and just like grotesque. And like he came out and was like, for sure I lied about this, you know what I mean? Like everybody knew that these things, but like it almost doesn't matter. And like I'm obsessed with that too. Like, why are we so invested in finding out like these horrible things that this guy made up about these people who are real people? It's like there's a way in which it becomes this like almost like a Greek mythology of these people who are very real people, but then he like elaborates on it or takes rumors as fact. I'm obsessed with Hollywood Babylon. It is something I definitely pulled on for the second book, for sure.
Yes. Well, for some reason, my mom had a lot of true crime when I was growing up, and that was on the bookshelf. And I later found out it was banned in the United States. So I'm not even sure how the copy came into our house, but I remember looking through it. And what's fascinating is, as you mentioned, Kenneth Anger, who was a filmmaker and photographer to an extent, he put together the kind of most horrific, salacious Hollywood stories and deaths. And then he added details to them, which they didn't need. They did not need to be embellished. But as, maybe middle schooler, way too young to be looking at this and looking at these pictures, I think that was, part and parcel of being fascinated with thrillers and mortality and crime. But there was also this element of tabloid commentary that was kind of new to me. And I think that what you do so well in your books is have commentary on that tabloid commentary. It's kind of satire very subtly, which I love. Can you talk a little bit about, tabloid and crime and the cross section of that?
Sure, absolutely. And yes, I'm the same. It's like Hollywood Babylon was a book I was thinking about a lot with the Hurricane Blonde, because it's such a fascinating document. I mean, it was banned in the United States, and I can't remember if it was for moral reasons or if it was like, this is libel. You know what I mean? Because there is stuff in there that's like, but I guess if you're dead, you can't sue, an estate can't sue for libel. So, so I was really thinking about that, about a big part of the key to the Hurricane Blonde for me when I was putting it together was the mythologies of Salma's family that she, and it's a thing. And I actually heard Taylor Jenkins Reid speak on this a little bit for Daisy Jones, where it's like, you're having to build a mythology. Like you're having to have the reader come in page one and be like, oh, there's a mythology here. And I don't know it because it's fiction, but you need people to believe in it. And so that was something I was really thinking about, was like, what is the mythology of her family? How did the press like create that or help that or fight against it? So I have a character in the book, Cherry, who's a tabloid reporter who plays an important role in various parts. And she kind of is the stand-in for the idea of the tabloids that could make or break your family. And I think that there's a shift to that to some degree in 2024. But for a long time in the Hollywood system, it was like, bad press would destroy somebody's career or would really shape how people saw you. So I have kind of layers of that in the family. We have Salma's parents, who are kind of the golden couple. They created this movie that like people look on as, again, I wanted it to be sort of like a Chinatown, which like often people consider one of the greatest American films. And then you've got her sister, who was kind of looked at as this bimbo and like kind of couldn't get out from under that, and had this nickname, the Hurricane Blonde, which comes from a long tradition of like commodifying women as various types of blondes. You had Jane Mansfield was called like the working man's Marilyn. And you had Thelma Todd, who died in mysterious circumstances, who was called the ice cream blonde. And then you had Jean Harlow, which is where we get the term the platinum blonde from. That there were these ways that you kind of like commodified women according to their hair color, and it was often blonde, which is very odd. And so I was kind of trying to speak to that, and that she gets this reputation for being Salma's older sister does, that gets this reputation for being difficult to work with, which I actually think is like one of the hardest things for women to shake, especially in Hollywood. And like men, when they're mercurial, are kind of seen as like, oh, he's a genius, he's tempestuous, he needs this to create. And women are like, she's hard to work with. And it's like, so that can like ruin a career, She's
crazy.
She's crazy. She's hard to work with. Like there's stories about, again, the making of the movie Chinatown, where Jack Nicholson gets in a dispute with Roman Polanski, which like we would have to do a whole other podcast to talk about the Roman Polanski of it all. But like Jack Nicholson and Roman Polanski get in a dispute because Nicholson won't stop watching the Lakers playoffs. And so Polanski goes into his trailer and like throws his TV out the window. So bad behavior on both parts of these men, right? Like that's like a pretty big reaction from a director. And it's also like, you're here to do a job, stop watching the Lakers. But Faye Dunaway is the one who comes out of that film with a reputation as somebody who is hard to work with. She, didn't like Polanski's long working hours. She was like all this stuff. And it's like, I don't know. The guys who are watching the basketball and the one who threw the TV out of the trailer, maybe they were hard to work with, but that's not like what the myth becomes. And so I really wanted to play, the narrative, like the power of narrative was something that I think tabloids have historically had a lot of hand in the way that we perceive certain stars and the way that we see them as either likable or not. And even with Salma, you see that, I was really thinking about with her, the way that we kind of looked at certain child stars, Lindsay Lohan or Drew Barrymore, even, where they kind of got this reputation for being wild. And nobody was like, hey, maybe a 17-year-old girl who's getting blackout drunk, like at the clubs, like maybe this is a problem and sad. Like it took us a really long time to look at things that way. And instead it just became this tabloid fever of like, out of control again, she's a problem. And I just sort of wanted to kind of look at the way that those narrative perceptions can color what we believe a person to be, and then what that person believes about themselves.
Yeah. Well, sadly, I think we're coming up on yet another round of that with this upcoming political season. I mean, we're going in now, presumably with a Black female presidential candidate, and that's going to just be, versus like against someone who is known for his brashness, arrogance, and bluster. And
Absolutely.
the way the media coverage is, it's going to be really, I think it's going to continue to be very informative and educational, the way the media kind of bridges that gap.
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree. And I mean, not to go too political, but like the last 2 days have been wild. And so like I'm going all in on Kamala. I'm excited about her. And I'm also like you said, I want to be very cognizant of the fact that like there are going to be horrible things said about her simply for the fact of her identity. And like that's absurd and unfair and real, and like that'll happen. And I'm also like going to be so excited to vote for a Black woman this fall. So let's go.
Let's go. I wanted to sort of just follow up on what you were talking about, about the kind of that split in perception, I guess, that we're talking about with Hollywood, old Hollywood, and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I think you do really well in the Hurricane Blonde as well is you have, as you mentioned, Selma's family, which is considered sort of old Hollywood royalty. There's a certain sheen and a luster and a respectability. Mm-hmm. And then you have her as a character. She's doing these bus tours where she's kind of doing the Hollywood tours of the kind of deaths, the Hollywood deaths and things. And there are other examples. I think that Cherry's like that a bit, where you could look at them as being a little more kind of like garish in a way, or like low rent, if you will. But what ends up happening is, I think it's an interesting perception split in that it ends up, I'm not going to ruin anything here, but it turns out that the more respectable, quote unquote, sort of Hollywood institution ends up being the one that is a lot more kind of corrupt and depraved. I wonder if you could maybe just talk a little bit about exploring that chasm.
Yeah, absolutely. In some ways, I don't think I was ever consciously thinking of this, but I think it does speak to my sort of like split attitudes about Hollywood, which is, like I said, like Hollywood, the idea that's this never ending parade of glamour, and you make these movies that tell these human stories and you get to like live forever on the screen, versus Hollywood Boulevard, where like you see tourists going there and you're like, oh, I think you're in the wrong place. Like it is not a glamorous place. It's not where you want to go. And that there are, and I love them because I love a good kitsch, but like there are tours of the stars homes. There are true crime tours. There are so many like questionable taste things happening in Hollywood. There's a place called the Museum of Death, which is cool. And also I have an appetite for stuff like that. And I came out of that being like, oh, I think I need a bath. That was kind of like, ugh. And so I think I was kind of trying to consciously explore that dichotomy of like, what I find so interesting. So Harvey Weinstein is the figure that kicks off this sort of public knowledge of how depraved Hollywood really can be, right? Like there have been plenty of scandals before, and I'm happy to be wrong about that. But I would say in like modern consciousness, the unveiling of Harvey Weinstein as the total predator that he was is sort of our first big reckoning with Hollywood. And then you start to look at other dominoes falling. And like, even as recently as a couple months ago, when that Quiet on the Set documentary came out that exposed like child actors and the predators that circle that. But what I have always found interesting is that like, we always knew that was happening, right? Like there is that term, the casting couch king. Like this was something that was an open secret that we always knew. And it just took us a really long time for it to be not an open secret, but just open knowledge and something that could be dealt with. And so that I think was sort of what was fueling, honestly, in a way, both of my books sort of, is that like Harvey Weinstein wasn't the start of predatorial practices. And he's also a man who has been a producer for a lot of movies that are really like wonderful, artistic, meaningful movies to people. But it's just this legacy of kind of corruption. And it's wanting to explore questions that I don't have easy answers to, which is, what do you do with films like Chinatown that I find personally meaningful and that have like informed my artistic sensibility? But like Roman Polanski absolutely did rape a child. So like, how do you battle with those things in your mind? And for too long, I think Hollywood was like, the ends justifies the means. And we're just starting to get into a moment where that may not be true, or where we need to find more complicated ways to discuss some of these projects and different things. If I had an easy answer to this, like, I would have written that book. But, you know, I think the best we can do is just try to wrestle with it and try to come up with better answers than like, we just have to say it's fine because we like someone's movies.
Right.
Yeah, and there's so much to unpack there. I was thinking about how you touch on, you know, in the kind of essence of the imposter character in Hollywood or Los Angeles as an imposter, and then the layer of very powerful, revered creatives, Polanski, Weinstein, Bill Cosby, Woody Allen.
Yeah.
I mean, the list goes on and on. And then once their kind of crimes are revealed and there's lots of, you know, hindsight and people talk about all of the indicators leading up to these revelations that these were very powerful men who had these kind of open secrets of predatory, abusive behavior that come out much later. Michael Jackson is another. And you realize like how, you know, enabling and complicit people around them are, you know, because of the money they make and the impact they have on culture. And it's so hard to, you know, determine how do you separate, you know, Rosemary's Baby is a huge influential film, you know, most of Polanski's films, in fact, but it is hard to reconcile his crimes against women, you know, among many others. The thing about Polanski that I think I would love to hear you talk about that is interesting is he is the intersection of being, you know, a predator, but also a victim of crime, you know, with the Sharon Tate murder. You know, he's kind of like the exact cross section of what you're writing about and what we're talking about. Have you explored that in your kind of research and work?
Yeah, I mean, not just the Sharon Tate murder, like he's also a Holocaust survivor and all of his family died in the Holocaust. And then he, you know, becomes a great director, marries Sharon Tate. She's 8.5 months pregnant with their baby, and she and the baby are murdered. I mean, truly a man with a, like, this is making light of something that I should not make light of, but like almost a Forrest Gumpian ability to experience like all huge major events of the 1900s, truly. And, you know, I don't know. Yeah, I don't really have an easy answer for him. I think for myself with the film, you know, I think you can't separate any one part of his identity, unfortunately. Like, I think I can very easily acknowledge and have a lot of empathy for a lot of the things that he went through. I think that also he had a sizable impact on the young woman negatively that he raped. And I think you can't say like one balances out the other. I think it makes it very complicated. I think oftentimes people who do things to hurt other people have been hurt themselves. And I don't think you can easily draw a clean line for anybody. But I think it's important to like acknowledge all of that humanity, absolutely, and still say like, and he still had this impact, and that, so you can't say, well, you know, one gets a freebie. I think with myself, the way I justify, I mean, it's the question too of can you separate the art from the artist? And for myself, I think about Chinatown, and I think about like that, or Rosemary's Baby. I mean, that he's the director, so it's ultimately his stamp on everything, but so many people were involved in that film that it is not just Polanski's film, you know, like I have a little harder time. And you could say the same about Michael Jackson, right? He had a producer, he had music writers and all the things, but it's a little harder when the voice is so singular. With a film, you're like, well, but you've got Jack Nicholson, you've got Faye Dunaway, you've got Robert Townsend, and who wrote it. And, but yeah, it's really hard. It's a really complicated question. And I think my answer to that, which is like not a very good answer, is that just we have to be willing to dive into those complexities and like wrestle with it, right? Like, I think it would be so much easier and cleaner if you could say you balance one side against the other and you get an ultimate ruling on whether somebody is good or bad. And I don't think that that is very realistic for most people. I'm sure there are absolute exceptions that I can think of, but that it's being able to kind of look at all those complexities and still see somebody's humanity, but also see like not everyone who went through what Polanski went through would have also raped a child. You know what I mean? So that you can't just equivocate it. I don't know. That's a really tough question.
Well, not to mention, I think, what mires things potentially further, and this is something you address beautifully in the book, is how you also have these power structures behind. You have a studio system behind them, or you have, a
Right.
record label behind them, or you have a publisher behind them, or whatever it is. And then you have these systems of power, huge sums of money, and all kinds of things that also incentivize people against making like a big deal or making stories out of these kinds of things. So that adds just like an extra layer to the,
Absolutely. And I think that's what's so maddening about Weinstein, right? Is that like it is such a clear case of so many people were aware that this was happening and so many people enabled it because they didn't want to rock the gravy train. That like that to me is so frustrating and crazy making, is that it wasn't one predator acting under the cover of night that nobody knew about. It was being enabled for years and years and years.
Yeah. I hear you on that.
Yeah.
I'm curious about something. Actually, I'm just thinking about the context and the framework of a lot of what you're talking about, where you grew up. And I wonder, I grew up, for instance, on a small town called Sag Harbor. It's on the east end of Long Island. Beautiful kind of beach resort town. And it's an old whaling village. It has a very kind of humble history, very blue collar town, manufacturing town in the kind of mid-century. But it's adjacent to the Hamptons, and it's adjacent to this huge kind of influx of like this summer resort town, a lot of glitz and glamour and money and all kinds of things like that. So we grew up as more or less regular kids, but we were kind of surrounded by the trappings of wealth and, yachts and all kinds of things. And it's occurring to me, I wonder if growing up as a Californian, but sort of on the outskirts, gave you a little bit of that outsider looking in perspective, if that was maybe something that pulled you as pulled your focus.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, I think especially moving to LA, like I think that there is a way that like moving to LA made me more aware of my Northern Californian roots, because I don't know if you guys are aware, but there is like a trash talking war going on between Northern California and Southern California. And it's really mostly only flows Northern California down. Like when I told people I was moving to LA, they were like, I'm so sorry. Do you have to? As if I'd been sentenced to living in the city that has the best weather year round. Like, no, I'm actually choosing to go there. So there is a way in which that sort of outsider sense fills me. It's also, I think, when you say that, it makes me think of, it's really interesting to be a novelist in Los Angeles, because there are so many people here who are writers, but they're screenwriters. And so that's almost always, if I do introduce myself as a writer, they assume I'm talking about screenwriting. And I say, no, novels, maybe one day screenwriting, but and it's just kind of a very different experience there. Whereas like if you were, say, in the Bay Area, if you said I'm a writer, no one would ever think you were talking about screenwriting. Yeah, so I think that there is definitely a way that like my being an outsider who lives in the city influences my work and my perspective. I also think that that's always often true of noir, is the sort of insider outside dynamic. Like, Raymond Chandler had the Simple Art of Murder of like, down these mean streets, a man must go who has, and then he lists all the things. And it's like, of course it's a man, but it's sort of the idea that it's somebody who's like of the scene, but can see outside of it, that you're not just blindly going where everyone is going. And I also think that that's also almost always a really strong position for a protagonist in any book, right? Is somebody who's like, both in the scene and outside of it enough to be a window to the reader and to also comment on what's happening.
Right. Yeah. That level of objectivity kind of right out of the gate helps also, I think, to frame the story and orient the reader in a lot of ways as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Halley, can you talk a little bit about the shift from making this decision, you're working in publishing, then you're deciding you want to be a writer full-time, getting an MFA. We touched on it a little bit earlier, the imposter syndrome of MFAs. But I'm actually really curious, that's a big life jump to decide I'm going to stop doing this pretty regular career and, take the plunge in becoming a novelist. So what was that transition like for you?
Yeah. So I should clarify. I do still work in publishing. I went from being, but I got a job in publishing in the Bay Area right out of college. Like I think I graduated on a Saturday and started as an intern on Monday. And so I worked my way up the ranks. I had this vision for my life. I think if you had asked me when I was 16, what do you want to do? I would have said I wanted to work in publishing and I wanted to live in San Francisco. And so I moved to San Francisco and I worked in publishing, worked my way up, became an assistant editor, and was pretty unhappy. Bay Area is a great city, but it wasn't for me. And I was like, it just wasn't fulfilling. And I was somebody who had thought of myself as a writer for almost my whole life. And as a kid, I think in some ways took it very seriously, and then was sort of like, okay, it's time for me to enter the workforce. It's time for me to put away childish things, and still thought of myself as a writer, and still was like, one day I'll write a book. And then it kind of occurred to me in my mid 20s that, I mean, there was a heartbreak involved. There was the sort of realization that like this life wasn't exactly like, I put myself on a track and I sort of hated the track, and was like, oh no, what am I going to do? And I had a moment of intuition, which I am not a particularly woo-woo person, but I just had this sort of like small voice inside that was like, you're going to go to grad school. You're going to really lean into your identity as a writer. You are not going to write a book just by saying, I'm going to write a book one day. You're going to write a book by doing it, and you have to actually do it. And so I said, okay. And I started applying to grad schools, and I wound up getting into a couple and decided to go to Otis College of Art and Design, down in LA, which was a very small program, sadly doesn't exist anymore, at an art school, and it ended up being more like 3 years because I took a semester off, writing what would become The Lady Upstairs. And it was a big gamble, and it was scary. And I had no idea where it was going to go. Like I said, I had no idea if I was going to like LA, but I kind of liked the idea of like, well, it's only 2 years. If you hate it, you can just cleanly move somewhere else afterwards. And it was the best gamble I've ever taken in my life, and I'm so grateful that I did.
I love that.
So I neither Liz or I are MFA program people. Like, we are people who are kind of winging it. I mean, in my mind anyway. And so I always have this idea that the going through an MFA program kind of confers a certain level of you did it the right way, or kind of, and you're shaking your head no. So maybe talk a little bit more about that, because I'm very curious.
So this is like the great debate on the internet among writers, right? Like, to MFA or to not MFA.
Right.
I had a great experience in my MFA program. It gave me 2+ years to really be just like wrapped up in a cocoon of working on my book. It taught me a lot. And like, I don't know if I could in good conscience recommend it to people if you're not like really getting it funded. It's an expensive thing that I think I had a very valuable experience, so I'm not trying to downplay that. But at the same time, I don't believe that there's anything I got in my MFA that you couldn't really have gotten by taking community classes, by joining other workshops, by just being a good and diligent reader. And also, as somebody who was working within genre and within MFA, talk about imposter syndrome. You come in and you're like, I like crime novels, and they're like, that's not literary, like it was so, and it became, I would say maybe, it was maybe an insecurity. I would say my program wasn't the worst at that. I've heard other horror stories, like our program, in fact, encouraged us to work on novels. I've heard a lot of MFAs are very much like, only short stories. You're going to learn how to polish short stories, and you're going to sell a short story collection, which like talk about things that don't sell that well. But like short stories are great too, by the way. I think they're wonderful and I love them. But like, it's so funny that there's this attitude. There's almost this like, and I actually did face this in my MFA. There's like a commerce averse attitude about it. I didn't learn how to write a query letter. I learned a little bit about how to look for an agent, but like, I learned a lot about like the realities of becoming a published author way outside of my MFA. It was sort of a taboo subject. And so like I said, I have no regrets about having done it. I met a lot of great people that are still important to me. and I learned a lot and got a lot out of it, but I like absolutely do not believe that you need an MFA, that it confers anything other than student debt, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And that especially if you're somebody who's writing genre, you're going to get a lot of side eyes from a lot of people who are trying to be the next David Foster Wallace.
Right.
And I have more I can say about that, but I'll be nice and I won't.
He keeps coming up. We had another episode where we were talking a bit about him. Well, I was just thinking back to my first year in publishing, was at Free Press, which sadly no longer exists. It was an imprint of Simon and Schuster. And there was like a glut of Iowa graduates. Like
Oh
I
yeah.
think we had wonderful fiction editors acquiring for the imprint, but there was a year where I think I did alone publicity on like 3 short story collections written by writers who had gone to Iowa, and they were beautifully written. They had clearly been workshopped within every inch of their life, and these were all authors who I think had really bright careers and had been kind of primed to have the luster of Iowa carry them, and they'd gotten agents and obviously book deals. But to your point, they had not been prepared for the business side of it. And when those very beautiful short story collections, sold under 2,000 copies because they just weren't given the budget or the marketing, these writers may or may not have gotten second book deals. So I think there's a real like kind of inflating sense that happens with some of these programs as far as like getting to the publishing part, but then once you're there, it's a different story. And I don't know the kind of conventional wisdom now within these programs if that's changed. So this was over 20 years ago, but I do remember having conversations with these writers, and the expectations of what they were coming from and then where they were finding themselves was very different.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not to say that like, I honestly, probably if you go to Iowa or like UT at the Missioner Center, like one of the top programs, you probably do have doors open for you that like most people don't get. You're getting like the top cream of agents coming in to talk to you, and there's certain advantages there, the same way that like if you go to Harvard, you're going to have access to like an alumni network that most of us do not have access to. But yeah, I think that like an MFA can be valuable, but I think it doesn't prepare you well for publishing. And I think that it is by no means any sort of marker of real writerness or even necessarily a better writer. Like, I don't know. There's so much stuff that I'm sorry to my old professors. I'm not trying to trash them. I learned a lot, but like, there's so many things that I'm like, God, I wish we talked more about story structure. I wish I'd been given more like practical tips for revision. I wish I had been told about like, a 3-act arc for characters. We didn't talk about any of that. We were reading theory and like being very heady about stuff, which was great. But like, where are the nitty gritty pieces that are really going to like help me become a better writer? I don't think I got that in my MFA, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
So clearly you're a writer and you learned writing, and story structure. I want to wager that it was from reading, because your backdrop is easily 1,000 books right now.
For sure.
And then also being an editor and working in the business. So I'm wondering like what in the pie chart of your kind of creative toolbox, where do you find is it kind of equal measure that all of these things have made you the writer you are, or is something more than the other?
Yeah, I would say, I think there's no substitute. I don't know if you guys agree with this, but I think there's no substitute for reading a lot, reading well, and reading widely, and just like seeing what other people have done and like learning to steal from them, like artistically, not plagiaristically, but like, oh, somebody did a structure like this, I might want to do something like that similarly. My own work as an editor for sure has informed it, but I would say probably the biggest single impact I had on sort of those nitty gritty practical pieces of writing was my experience in Pitch Wars, which I don't know if you guys remember Pitch Wars, but it was an online, I don't know what the right way to call it is, revision workshop or contest. I mean, a lot of people, I know the year I applied, about 4,000 people applied for about 120 spots. And if you got accepted, you would work with somebody who was donating their time basically to act as their beta reader and tell you like, here's how we are going to fix your book. Here's how we're going to like market it. And so you would come out of it with a revised manuscript, a query, and you had this agent showcase at the end to like pitch directly to agents. That was like so helpful. But one of the biggest things that ever happened, I mean, first of all, I met my mentor. I was lucky enough to be picked by the writer Lane Fargo, who wrote Temper and They Never Learn. Yeah. And she has the book The Favorites coming out, and she is now like a really good friend of mine, and it's just wonderful. She's like my fairy writing godmother. But like the first thing she ever said to me about The Lady Upstairs was, she was like, this is so great. Like, I love this book. The vibe of it is great, but your midpoint is in the wrong place. And I was like, oh my God, such helpful feedback. What's a midpoint? Let's start there. And so she made me read Save the Cat Writes a Novel, which, you know, people will have varying thoughts, I think, about books that kind of give a blueprint for how to structure a story. I think I understand that, but I also like the sort of story structure we all know, with the rising action, climax, and falling action. Like, there's a reason that has been around for as long as stories have been told, which is that it like feels good to follow that trajectory. And so reading that book and kind of learning how to like break down those story beats and like come up with a structure was mind blowing and was like extremely formative, and something I'm still like learning how to do better in my work. And so I like kind of look at Pitch Wars as a thing that not only changed my life in terms of helping me sign with an agent and revising my book, but also changed my understanding of what it was to be a writer.
You mentioned a few minutes ago the idea of reading widely, which I love and always also recommend to young aspiring writers. I think with your books thus far, there are some fairly obvious influences. You have thriller, crime, mystery, noir. But what might people be surprised to know that you're an avid reader or a fan of?
Oh, good question. Well, I have one weird answer that isn't a book, but I've read a lot of everything in my life. I loved fantasy as a kid. I loved historical fiction, which is interesting. When I was a kid, those were both genres that felt like they centered women a lot. So I think that there's like a way in which my sensibility really kind of came from that. This sort of, especially historical fiction, had like those Dear America books when I was a kid, and just different things where it took like a historical thing you knew about and then told it from a woman's perspective. And I do think that there's a way in which that was really informative to me when I was thinking about my own books that are kind of noir inflected, where it's like, well, what's the woman's POV in this? Probably would have been drawn to that anyway as a woman, but like that was something that I really like drew from. Different poetry I love. I read a lot of nonfiction too. I think that there is a way that nonfiction can be so excellent for prose writers of like fiction to read, because the sentences are so clear and informative. And like, yes, we want to put an artistic spin on things that we write, but like, I know for myself, sometimes I can get a little too caught up in like, how do we put a metaphor here and all these different things? And like, sometimes you just, especially in an early draft, if you can just say it clearly, that's the best thing that you can do. You know what I mean? Like, you can also add the whirligigs and all the other things on it, but like, it is actually extremely hard to write a clear, concise, lovely sentence. And so many nonfiction writers do that. And that's a thing that I've learned from. One thing that I think that's not books, but I think is like, I am a big believer in follow wherever your artistic like imagination goes. I have recently become obsessed with documentaries about the scandals of pro wrestling. And I don't know why, but I am like reading those like a rich text. I think there is something endlessly fascinating to me about like people who kind of put on a persona the way that wrestlers do, and then have to kind of live in those personas. So like, talk about imposters in a way. I guess my point there is really just like, the act of reading widely teaches you a lot about the act of writing, but it also starts to teach you about your own obsessions. And I think that's a really valuable thing for a writer to start to like see and develop in themselves. Is like, what am I obsessed with? Because it might be weirder than you think.
Right. Right.
I love that, and I share that obsession with the rise and fall of pro wrestlers. Talk about Greek mythology, and
Yes,
I mean it's
okay.
mythology within mythology, because these are, you know, men and women, you know, because there's some
Mhm.
great female pro and amateur wrestling stories out there now,
Oh,
but they're
absolutely.
building out these characters, and you know, in conjunction with other wrestlers, their characters and how they all interact. I mean, they're writers,
Absolutely.
and their real
Absolutely.
life stories are, you know, riddled with addiction and recovery, and there's just some bizarre murder. I mean, it is
Totally.
quite a subcategory of drama in culture that I think as writers we should all look into. Yeah,
Absolutely.
love
Totally agree. And like they build dynasties, sometimes even within their own
that.
families. You're totally right. They are writers. It's so they're
Mhm.
writers and then they're also actors and athletes. It's an odd combo.
Promoters, I mean, it is, yeah, we could do a whole other episode about this, and maybe we should.
And maybe we should.
Well, to wrap it up for now, at least, did you both watch the series Glow? Okay,
Yes,
Yes.
yeah,
Glow. I
yeah.
thought was
And I watched the original Glow when
oh,
I was in high
of
school.
course, yeah, exactly. But I thought it was
Yeah.
such a great. It sort of dovetails a lot of the things we're talking about now, because it's this great historical thing, and it's got all of that drama and all those, you know,
Mhm.
allegiances and alliances. But it also is really interesting to see it with a very feminist take, and to see sort of the behind the scenes stuff about how the deck was really stacked against that whole league from the jump, and
Totally.
how those power
Yes.
dynamics played
Totally.
out. Yeah.
Mm.
Hmm. And sadly that show's
That's
not
worth a
on
rewatch.
yeah, it is. And I don't think it's coming back, which is like so disappointing. I loved that
It was
show.
great. I know. They set it up really well for a next season, and I don't think it has been renewed. Unfortunately, it's really I don't think they have the
Mm.
viewership, which sucks. But it was a
Does.
great piece of art. Yeah,
Yeah.
Let's start the call. Like, bring it
let's
back.
do that. That's cool.
Yes.
That's cool.
Revive Glow.
All right, the petition starts here. I love it.
Yes.
With our last minute or so, is there anything you're working on now,
Hmm.
or that we can be excited for to have you back on to talk about?
Sure. So I'm working on my third book right now. Haven't showed it to anyone, haven't showed it to my agent, haven't showed it to my editor. I really struggled writing my second book, so I kind of wanted to take a different way of doing this. But what I can say is that con artists are a part of it in
Mm.
like multiple different ways. There are multiple different levels of imposters in the book. And this one actually takes us outside of Los Angeles to the forests of France.
Ooh.
So it'll be something new and different a little bit.
Nice.
Oh, sign me up.
Well, if I may just say, you may have had a struggle writing that second book, but I absolutely did not have a struggle reading that second book. It is phenomenal.
Oh,
I really, really
Yes,
loved it.
so
It
good.
thank you so much.
so many things that you did so beautifully in there. I just think that
Yeah.
Oh,
it's
thank you.
well, I feel like I don't know if you feel like this, being both a fan of reading and also yourself a writer of noir, but it's such
Yeah.
a balancing act with being able to write something where it's not too referential to it, or it doesn't come off as kind of gimmicky, or like it's not overly
Mhm.
stylized. And you know, you got into some really like real world themes in it in a really kind of in just a subtle way, but very effective. And I don't know, I can't say enough great things about that book.
Yeah.
So
Thank
And
you so
sister
much.
story. I love sisters.
yeah,
There's a
Yes.
great
Yeah.
family sister story,
Yeah.
and survivor's guilt, which we'll have to talk about the next time we have you come on.
Yes.
So,
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
so where can people find you?
So you can find me on Twitter at Halley_Sutton, I'm pretty sure. And you can find me on Instagram at Halley Sutton 25. Oh, looked like my internet blanked up for a second. And I actually have an author newsletter called Too Many Tabs, where I interview both authors and bookstagrammers about what makes them feel creative and inspired about reading. And I'll reach out to you guys separately, but I would love to interview you for my newsletter if you're open to it.
Absolutely would be. Let's keep it going.
Absolutely.
Thank you,
Oh, that sounds
Great.
great.
Hallie. This was wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on, for sharing your time, for sharing everything with our listeners as well. It was a real pleasure.
Yes. And for
It was the
fielding
pleasure was
very
all
hard
mine.
questions. Thank you.
I know, we solved it. We totally solved it all. We got it. The question of art versus the artist ends here, folks. Thank you so much for having me. This was so lovely. It was such a joy to speak with you both today, and I'm such a fan of the podcast. So thank you for having me on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Imposter Hour with Liz and Greg is created and hosted by us, Elizabeth Keenan and Greg Wands. The show is produced and edited by Kate Herget, creator of the Book Wild Podcast Collective. Our original theme music was composed by Scott Leeds, and our logo was designed by Steve Luoma.
You can find us on IG at Imposter Hour Podcast and online at imposterhour.com. Thank you for listening.